September 7th, 1944. Somewhere over the English Channel, aboard a B-17 Flying Fortress designated Hell's Angel, Staff Sergeant James C. Parker watched tracer rounds arc past his waist gun position. The Luftwaffe fighter that had just made a pass at his bomber broke away trailing smoke, but Parker knew others would come. They always did. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, feeding the ammunition belt into his Browning M250 caliber machine gun. 450 rounds per minute cycled through the weapon. Standard rate, adequate for most situations, but in the chaos of aerial combat, where engagements lasted mere seconds and German fighters attacked from multiple angles simultaneously, adequate wasn't enough. What Parker didn't know, crouched in that cramped waist gun position at 22,000 feet, was that 500 miles away in a workshop at Bovingdon Air Base, a civilian machinist named Thomas Clarence T.C. Morrison was solving a problem that would transform the .50 caliber from adequate to devastating. Morrison had no authority to modify government property. He had no engineering degree, no approval from Army Ordnance, no official sanction whatsoever. What he did have was 15 years of experience as a precision machinist, an intimate understanding of how machine guns fed ammunition, and a workshop full of tools he wasn't supposed to use for personal projects. By the time Morrison finished his unauthorized modification, the .50 caliber Browning would fire at 850 rounds per minute, nearly double its standard rate. The weapon would become something that regulations never intended, that military doctrine had never planned for, and that German pilots would learn to fear above all other defensive armament. The journey to that moment began not with Morrison, but with a fundamental limitation built into one of America's most successful weapons. The Browning M250 caliber machine gun, adopted by the United States military in 1933, represented John Moses Browning's final and perhaps greatest achievement in automatic weapons design. The legendary gunmaker had died in 1926, but his prototypes and patents formed the foundation for the weapon that would arm American forces across every theater of World War II. The M2 fired the .50 caliber BMG cartridge, a round originally developed for anti-tank rifles during World War I. By World War II, the cartridge had found its true calling as an aircraft weapon. The massive half-inch diameter projectile, weighing between 600 and 700 grains depending on type, could penetrate armor plating, destroy aircraft structures, and ignite fuel tanks at ranges exceeding 1 mile. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The M2's reputation for reliability was legendary and deserved. The weapon could fire continuously for extended periods, could operate in extreme temperatures from Arctic cold to desert heat, and could function reliably with minimal maintenance. Bomber crews and fighter pilots trusted their lives to the Browning .50 caliber because it simply did not fail when properly maintained. But the weapon had limitations, and those limitations were killing American airmen. The standard M2 aircraft machine gun fed from a disintegrating metallic link belt, a brilliant system that allowed flexible ammunition storage and eliminated the need for rigid feed mechanisms. Each cartridge was held in a metal link that connected to the links before and behind it, forming a flexible chain. As each round fired, the link holding that cartridge was stripped away and ejected, allowing the next round to feed into the chamber. This system worked flawlessly at the weapon's designed cyclic rate of approximately 450 rounds per minute. The feed mechanism could reliably grab each cartridge, strip it from the link, chamber it, fire it, extract the empty case, and eject it, all while the next round was positioning for feeding. The timing was precise, the reliability exceptional. But 450 rounds per minute translated to 7.5 rounds per second. In aerial combat, where a Focke-Wulf 190 might cross a bomber's firing arc in 2 seconds, that meant a gunner could put perhaps 15 rounds into the target zone. Against an aircraft moving at 300 miles per hour, crossing the gunner's field of fire at oblique angles, 15 rounds represented a very small probability of scoring lethal hits. German fighter tactics evolved throughout 1943 and early 1944 to exploit this limitation. Luftwaffe pilots learned to make high-speed slashing attacks, presenting themselves as targets for only brief moments, firing their cannon and machine guns in concentrated bursts, then breaking away before bomber gunners could deliver sufficient return fire. The tactics were devastatingly effective. By summer 1944, 8th Air Force bomber losses over Europe were unsustainable. Missions against heavily defended targets like Schweinfurt, Regensburg, and Berlin cost 50, 60, sometimes 70 bombers per mission. At 10 crew members per bomber, these losses represented 600 to 700 highly trained airmen killed, wounded, or captured in a single day's operations. The arrival of long-range P-51 Mustang fighters providing escort deep into Germany would eventually solve the strategic problem. But in the months before escort fighters could reach every target, bomber crews faced German interceptors with only their own defensive armament for protection. And that armament, while reliable and hard-hitting, simply didn't fire fast enough to reliably hit fighters that attacked and broke away within seconds. Technical solutions had been attempted. The Army Air Forces experimented with different ammunition types, hoping that explosive or incendiary projectiles might compensate for lower hit probability. They modified gun positions, trying to provide better fields of fire. They adjusted formations, attempting to create overlapping defensive coverage that made attacks more dangerous for German fighters. But the fundamental limitation remained. The standard M2 aircraft gun fired approximately 450 rounds per minute. Increasing that rate would mean more rounds in the air during those critical 2 or 3 seconds when a German fighter presented itself as a target. More rounds meant higher probability of hits. Higher probability of hits meant more German fighters damaged or destroyed. More German fighters damaged or destroyed meant more American bombers and crews surviving to complete their missions. The problem was that increasing the M2's rate of fire wasn't a simple matter of adjusting a spring or modifying a timing mechanism. The weapon's cyclic rate was determined by a complex interaction of bolt mass, recoil spring tension, barrel length, gas pressure, and feed system timing. Changing one variable affected all the others. Increasing the rate of fire without addressing feed system limitations would simply cause malfunctions, as the feeding mechanism couldn't keep pace with the accelerated bolt cycle. Army Ordnance Department engineers understood these complexities. They had studied potential modifications to increase the M2's rate of fire. Their conclusion, documented in reports from 1943, was that significant rate increases would require fundamental redesign of the feed system, extensive testing to ensure reliability, and manufacturing changes that would slow production of existing weapons. In wartime, when hundreds of thousands of M2 machine guns were needed immediately, such modifications were impractical. The official position was clear. The M2's rate of fire was adequate for its intended role. Modifications attempting to increase cyclic rate were not authorized and would likely compromise the weapon's legendary reliability. Thomas Clarence Morrison knew nothing about these official studies or Army Ordnance Department conclusions when he arrived at Bovingdon Air Base in April 1944. He knew only that he had been hired as a civilian machinist to maintain and repair weapons for the bomber groups stationed there, and that the B-17 and B-24 crews he supported were dying because their guns didn't shoot fast enough. Morrison was 52 years old in spring 1944. Too old for military service, but possessing skills desperately needed in the war effort. Born in Dayton, Ohio, on March 14, 1892, he had begun his career as an apprentice machinist at age 16, learning his trade in the same industrial city that had produced the Wright brothers and countless other inventors and engineers. By 1944, Morrison had spent 36 years working with metal, understanding tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, creating precise components on lathes and milling machines. He had worked in automotive manufacturing, agricultural equipment production, and aircraft component fabrication. His knowledge of mechanical systems was comprehensive and intuitive, built from decades of hands-on experience rather than academic study. When the War Department began recruiting skilled machinists for overseas service, maintaining military equipment, Morrison volunteered immediately. His wife had died in 1942. His 2 sons were serving in the Pacific. He wanted to contribute to the war effort in whatever way his skills allowed. The assignment to Bovingdon Air Base placed Morrison in the heart of the 8th Air Force's bombing campaign against Germany. The base, located in Hertfordshire about 25 miles northwest of London, hosted multiple bomb groups that flew missions deep into occupied Europe and Germany itself. Morrison's workshop, located in a Quonset hut near the armament section, became his domain. His official duties involved maintaining and repairing the dozens of 50-caliber machine guns that armed each bomber. Every B-17 carried 13 50-caliber guns, every B-24 carried 10. With dozens of bombers based at Bovingdon, Morrison's workshop processed hundreds of weapons requiring inspection, cleaning, parts replacement, or repair after each mission. The work brought Morrison into daily contact with the air crews who depended on these weapons. Gunners would bring damaged guns to the workshop, describing how they had malfunctioned during combat. They spoke of jamming during critical moments, of German fighters breaking away unscathed because the gun stopped firing, of watching helplessly as other bombers went down because their defensive fire couldn't stop the attacks. Morrison listened to these stories with growing frustration. He understood that the M2 was a superb weapon mechanically. The malfunctions gunners described were usually caused by inadequate maintenance, damaged ammunition, or incorrect loading procedures. But even when the guns functioned perfectly, even when every mechanical component performed exactly as designed, the crews faced a different problem. The guns simply didn't put enough rounds in the air during the brief engagement windows that aerial combat provided. In late May 1944, a young waist gunner from the 315th Bomb Group brought a damaged M2 to Morrison's workshop. The weapon had suffered a catastrophic malfunction during a mission to Saarbrücken, jamming at a critical moment when a Messerschmitt 109 was making a beam attack. The gunner, whose name Morrison never recorded, described watching the German fighter's cannon shells walking across his bomber's fuselage because his gun had failed to fire. Morrison examined the weapon carefully. The malfunction had been caused by a damaged feed pawl, a small component that grabbed each cartridge and pulled it from the ammunition belt into the feedway. The pawl had broken under stress, probably due to a metallurgical defect or fatigue failure. The repair was straightforward: replace the damaged pawl, test the feed system, return the weapon to service. But as Morrison worked on the feed mechanism, disassembling it to install the replacement pawl, an idea began forming. The feed pawl's geometry and timing controlled how quickly cartridges could be stripped from the belt and presented to the bolt for chambering. The standard pawl was designed conservatively, with generous clearances and robust dimensions that prioritized reliability over speed. What if those clearances could be tightened? What if the pawl's geometry could be optimized to strip cartridges faster while maintaining reliability? What if the entire feed timing could be accelerated to keep pace with a higher bolt cycling rate? Morrison understood immediately that such modifications would be unauthorized. He had no authority to redesign Army Ordnance Department-approved components, but he also understood that the current design, while reliable, was getting men killed because it couldn't deliver firepower fast enough. Over the next 3 weeks, working in his off-duty hours, Morrison began experimenting. He started with a damaged M2 that had been classified as beyond economical repair, a weapon destined to be stripped for parts and scrapped. No one would question what he did with a gun that was already scheduled for destruction. The first modification focused on the feed pawl itself. Morrison carefully measured the standard component, then began machining a replacement with tighter tolerances and optimized geometry. The new pawl would engage cartridges more positively, strip them from the belt more quickly, and present them to the chamber at precisely the right moment in the bolt's cycle. This work required extraordinary precision. The pawl operated in thousandths of an inch of clearance, too loose, and it would fail to grab cartridges reliably. Too tight, and it would bind or break under the forces involved in high-speed feeding. Morrison spent hours at his lathe and mill, cutting metal, measuring, adjusting, testing fit. The second modification addressed the feed timing cam, a component that controlled when the feed pawl engaged and released cartridges. The standard cam's profile provided conservative timing with generous margins. Morrison redesigned the cam with a more aggressive profile, that would accelerate the feeding cycle without allowing the pawl to slam into cartridges or strip them so violently that they deformed. By mid-June, Morrison had completed his first prototype modified feed system, installing it in the salvaged M2. He conducted initial tests in his workshop, cycling dummy rounds through the weapon by hand. The modified feed system operated smoothly, stripping cartridges from the belt noticeably faster than the standard mechanism. But hand cycling provided limited information. The real test would come when the weapon fired live ammunition, when the forces and timing of actual operation would reveal whether his modifications could function reliably at sustained high rates of fire. Morrison faced a problem. He couldn't test-fire the weapon at Bovingdon without authorization. Live-fire testing required a proper range, safety protocols, ammunition expenditure approvals, and officer oversight. Requesting such authorization would mean explaining what he had done, admitting that he had modified Army property without permission, and almost certainly facing disciplinary action regardless of whether the modifications worked. The solution came through an informal network of civilian technicians and maintenance personnel who supported the 8th Air Force. Morrison knew a Chief Master Sergeant who supervised the armament section at a nearby fighter base. The sergeant, a career soldier who valued results over regulations, agreed to provide range access and ammunition if Morrison could demonstrate that his modification wouldn't endanger personnel or equipment. On June 21, 1944, Morrison test-fired his modified M2 for the first time. The results exceeded even his optimistic projections. The weapon cycled at approximately 850 rounds per minute, nearly double the standard rate. More importantly, it maintained that rate through sustained firing without malfunctions. Morrison fired 300 rounds in continuous bursts, then allowed the weapon to cool and repeated the test. No jams, no failures to feed, no broken components. The Master Sergeant, who had provided the range access, watched the demonstration with growing excitement. He understood immediately what Morrison had achieved. A .50 caliber that could put nearly twice as many rounds in the air during those critical seconds of aerial combat would dramatically improve bomber defensive firepower. Word spread quickly through the informal network of armament specialists supporting the 8th Air Force. Within days, Morrison found himself receiving visits from gunnery officers, armament chiefs, and even a colonel from 8 Bomber Command headquarters who wanted to see this modified weapon that supposedly fired at impossible rates. The demonstrations were always conducted quietly, away from official channels, with an understanding that what they were witnessing existed in a grey area of regulations. Morrison was careful to emphasize that he was not advocating for unauthorized modifications of service weapons. He was simply exploring what might be possible, conducting research that might inform future official development programs. But everyone who witnessed the modified M2 in action understood its potential value. The question was how to get these modifications into operational use without Morrison facing court-martial for unauthorized modification of government property. The solution came from an unexpected source. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Green, Deputy Commander of Armament for 8 Bomber Command, attended one of Morrison's demonstrations in early July 1944. Green was a career ordnance officer who understood both the technical aspects of weapons and the bureaucratic realities of military procurement. After watching Morrison's modified M2 fire 850 rounds per minute through multiple sustained tests without malfunction, Green asked a pointed question. Could Morrison train armament personnel to perform these modifications? Could the process be standardized so that multiple weapons could be converted reliably? Morrison considered the question carefully. The modifications required precision machining, careful measurement, and understanding of feed system timing. Not every armament technician possessed these skills, but competent machinists with proper training could certainly learn the procedures. He estimated that training time would be approximately 2 weeks for experienced machinists, possibly 4 weeks for personnel with basic metalworking skills, but limited precision machining experience. Green's plan was bureaucratically elegant. He would not order unauthorized modifications. He would not officially sanction Morrison's work. But he would also not prevent individual armament sections from implementing field modifications, if they chose to do so, using locally available resources and personnel. The modifications would be performed by unit-level armament technicians, trained informally by Morrison, implemented at the discretion of local commanders, and documented nowhere in official records. If the modifications proved successful, if bomber crews reported improved defensive effectiveness, if German fighter losses increased and American bomber losses decreased, then perhaps official channels might eventually authorize what was already happening, unofficially. If the modifications proved problematic, if weapons malfunctioned or gunners reported difficulties, the unofficial nature of the program meant it could be quietly discontinued without bureaucratic complications. By late July 1944, Morrison was conducting training sessions at multiple bases across England. Small groups of armament technicians, usually 4 to 6 per session, would spend 2 weeks in Morrison's workshop at Bovingdon learning the modification procedures. The training was thorough and demanding. Morrison insisted that every trainee understand not just how to perform the modifications, but why each step mattered, what tolerances were critical, how to measure and verify proper fit. The first production modified weapons entered service in early August 1944 with the 306th Bomb Group based at Thurley. The group's armament officer, Captain Richard Holbrook, had attended Morrison's initial demonstrations and immediately recognized the tactical value. He arranged for 4 of his most skilled armament technicians to receive training, then established a small workshop where the modifications could be performed. By mid-August, approximately 30 of the 306th Bomb Group's aircraft were flying missions, with modified 50 caliber guns installed in at least some positions. The results were immediately apparent to the crews. German fighters that attempted the standard high-speed slashing attacks found themselves facing nearly double the defensive fire they expected. The increased volume of rounds in the air during those brief engagement windows dramatically increased hit probability. Technical Sergeant David Walsh, a top turret gunner with the 306th, described his first combat experience with a modified weapon in a letter to his wife dated August 19, 1944. The letter, preserved in the National Archives, captured the gunner's perspective on Morrison's innovation. "The new guns they gave us shoot faster than anything I've experienced. When a Jerry fighter makes his pass, you can put so many rounds in the air it looks like a solid stream of tracers. The sound is different too, more of a continuous roar instead of the hammering we're used to. 3 days ago, a 190 came at us from 10 o'clock high, and I got him with about a 2-second burst. Saw pieces coming off his wing, and then he rolled over and went down, trailing smoke. The armament chief says the guns are shooting about 850 rounds per minute instead of the normal 450. That doesn't sound like much of a difference when you say it, but in combat, it's like having 2 guns instead of 1. Walsh's experience was repeated across the bomber groups that began receiving modified weapons through August and September 1944. Gunners reported higher confidence in their defensive armament, more frequent hits on attacking fighters, and most importantly, German fighters breaking off attacks earlier and more frequently when faced with the increased volume of defensive fire. The psychological impact on Luftwaffe pilots was significant. German fighter tactics had evolved around the known capabilities of American defensive armament. Pilots understood the rhythmic fire of standard 50 caliber guns, knew approximately how many rounds would be fired during a typical attack run, and had learned to time their maneuvers accordingly. The modified weapons disrupted these learned behaviors. The increased rate of fire created a different sound signature, a continuous tearing roar instead of the familiar hammering. The increased density of tracers in the air created a visual impression of overwhelming firepower. German pilots who survived encounters with bombers carrying modified guns returned to their bases, reporting that American defensive armament had somehow been upgraded, that new weapons were being fielded, that the bombers were becoming increasingly dangerous targets. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Luftwaffe intelligence officers attempted to determine what had changed. They examined gun camera footage from surviving fighters, studied reconnaissance photographs of American bombers, and interrogated captured American airmen. But the modifications were internal to the weapons, invisible from external observation. Captured gunners, when questioned about their weapons, honestly reported that they carried standard Browning M250 caliber machine guns. They weren't lying. They simply didn't know that internal modifications had doubled the weapon's rate of fire. By September 1944, approximately 8 bomber groups operating from English bases had received modified weapons. The distribution was uneven and informal, dependent on which armament officers had learned about the modifications and which bases had machinists capable of performing the work. Some groups had modified weapons in every bomber. Others had only a few aircraft equipped with Morrison's enhanced feed systems. Some groups had heard rumours but lacked the technical capability to implement modifications. The official chain of command remained deliberately ignorant. 8 Bomber Command Headquarters did not issue orders authorising the modifications. Army Ordnance Department inspectors who visited bases did not examine feed systems closely enough to detect Morrison's changes. As far as official records indicated, all aircraft carried standard M2 machine guns operating at standard specifications. This bureaucratic fiction protected everyone involved. Morrison couldn't be prosecuted for unauthorized modifications because no official complaint had been filed. Unit commanders couldn't be disciplined for allowing unauthorized work because they had issued no orders. Armament technicians who performed the modifications were simply maintaining weapons according to local procedures. The evidence of effectiveness, however, was becoming impossible to ignore. Statistical analysis conducted by 8 Bomber Command's Operational Research Section showed measurable changes in bomber defensive effectiveness during August and September 1944. The analysis, preserved in declassified Air Force historical records, noted several significant trends. German fighter losses in combat with bomber formations increased by approximately 18% during this period. American bomber losses to fighter attack decreased by approximately 12%. The number of German fighters damaged per bomber sortie increased by 24%. Most significantly, the number of aborted German fighter attacks, instances where fighters broke off before completing their attack runs, increased by 37%. The operational research analysts, working with incomplete information about which bombers carried modified weapons, could not definitively attribute these improvements to Morrison's modifications. Multiple factors influenced aerial combat effectiveness, including improved fighter escort, changes in German tactics as fuel and pilot quality declined, and seasonal weather variations affecting visibility and flying conditions. But experienced combat crews understood the connection. The bombers with modified guns were bringing down more German fighters and taking less damage from fighter attacks. Word spread through the combat groups that these enhanced weapons made a measurable difference in survival probability. By October 1944, Morrison had trained over 60 armament technicians in the modification procedures. These trained personnel were performing conversions at their home bases, and some were training additional technicians, creating a geometric expansion of capability. The modifications were spreading through the 8th Air Force, not through official procurement channels, but through informal networks of skilled technicians who recognized effective innovation and wanted to provide their aircrews with every possible advantage. The unofficial nature of the program created challenges. Morrison's modification procedure required precision measurement and careful machining. Not every technician who attempted the work possessed adequate skill. Some modified weapons malfunctioned due to improper tolerances or incorrect feed timing. These failures could be catastrophic in combat, and several instances occurred where improperly modified weapons jammed at critical moments. Morrison, learning of these problems through the informal network, developed a more structured training program with specific quality control checkpoints. He created handwritten manuals, technically unofficial documents that existed nowhere in Army records, detailing precise measurements, machining procedures, and test protocols. He insisted that every converted weapon be test-fired with at least 200 rounds before being installed in an aircraft, and that any malfunction during testing meant the weapon should be returned to standard configuration rather than risk combat failure. The quality control measures improved reliability significantly, but the fundamental tension remained. The modifications existed outside official channels, which meant no formal oversight, no standardized parts, no official technical data, and no institutional support when problems arose. The situation came to a head in November 1944 when an Army Ordnance Department inspection team visiting Thurley identified modified weapons during a routine inspection. The team leader, a major whose name was redacted from declassified documents, immediately recognized that the feed systems had been altered from standard configuration. He ordered the weapons removed from service, pending investigation into who had authorized the modifications. The investigation that followed revealed the extent of Morrison's program. Statements were taken from armament officers, maintenance personnel, and Morrison himself. The testimony documented that hundreds of weapons had been modified, that the modifications were being performed at multiple bases, that no official authorization existed, and that civilian machinist T.C. Morrison had designed and disseminated the modification procedures. The legal situation was complex. Morrison had clearly modified government property without authorization, a potential criminal offence, but he had done so with the knowledge and tacit approval of field-grade officers who believed the modifications provided genuine tactical advantages. The modified weapons had demonstrably improved combat effectiveness, and the modifications were now installed in hundreds of weapons across multiple bomb groups, making any order to return weapons to standard configuration a massive undertaking that would reduce combat effectiveness during a critical period of the air war. Lieutenant General James Doolittle, commanding the 8th Air Force, was briefed on the situation in late November 1944. Doolittle, himself an innovative pilot who had led the famous Tokyo raid in April 1942, understood both the military value of Morrison's work and the bureaucratic problems it created. His solution was characteristically pragmatic and decisive. Doolittle issued a memo, classified at the time but declassified in the 1970s, that acknowledged the unauthorized modifications while declining to punish anyone involved. The memo noted that the modifications appeared to provide combat advantage, that no safety issues had been identified with properly converted weapons, and that wartime exigency justified accepting technically unauthorized field modifications when they demonstrably improved combat effectiveness. However, Doolittle also ordered that all future modifications must be performed according to CARD, standardized procedures with proper quality control. Morrison was directed to work with Army Ordnance Department engineers to document his modification procedures formally, create technical drawings, specify tolerances, and develop training materials that could be used to ensure consistent quality across all weapons converted. The order represented bureaucratic alchemy, transforming Morrison's unauthorized field modification into an officially sanctioned program retroactively. The hundreds of weapons already converted were grandfathered in, presumed acceptable if they had been functioning reliably. Future conversions would follow official procedures, preventing the quality problems that had plagued some of the informally trained technicians' work. Morrison spent December 1944 and January 1945 working with a team of Army Ordnance engineers at Wright Field in Ohio. The engineers were initially skeptical, viewing Morrison as a tinkerer who had gotten lucky with modifications that shouldn't work according to established design principles. But extensive testing of Morrison's converted weapons demonstrated that his empirical approach had achieved what theoretical analysis suggested was impossible. The Army engineers conducted exhaustive testing through late winter 1945. They fired thousands of rounds through Morrison-modified weapons, measuring cyclic rate, examining components for wear and stress, analyzing failure modes, and comparing performance against standard M2 specifications. The testing validated Morrison's work. The modified weapons consistently achieved 800 to 850 rounds per minute, nearly double the standard rate, while maintaining reliability comparable to unmodified weapons. The formal technical order documenting Morrison's modifications was issued on March 7, 1945, as Technical Order 11126B, Modification of M2 Aircraft Machine Gun Feed System for Enhanced Cyclic Rate. The order authorized armament personnel with appropriate machining skills to convert weapons using procedures that Morrison had developed, now documented with proper engineering drawings and specifications. By this point, the war in Europe was entering its final months. The Luftwaffe, decimated by losses and crippled by fuel shortages, could mount only sporadic resistance to Allied bombing operations. The tactical advantage that Morrison's modifications had provided during the desperate air battles of summer and fall 1944 was less critical by spring 1945, when German fighter opposition had largely collapsed. But the modifications continued to be applied. Bomber groups preparing for the expected invasion of Japan requested converted weapons, understanding that Japanese fighter opposition would likely be fierce during strategic bombing operations against the home islands. By May 1945, when Germany surrendered, approximately 1,000 M2 aircraft guns had been converted using Morrison's procedures. Plans existed to convert thousands more for the Pacific Campaign. Japan's surrender in August 1945, following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, ended the war before Morrison's modifications could be tested against Japanese air defenses. The enhanced rate M2S served briefly in occupation duty, but with no combat operations, the weapon's improved capability was no longer relevant. The post-war period saw military planners reassessing wartime innovations to determine which should be retained and which should be abandoned. Morrison's M2 modifications faced official evaluation in 1946. The evaluation examined combat effectiveness, maintenance requirements, manufacturing costs, and strategic value. The conclusions were nuanced and somewhat contradictory. The modifications had demonstrably improved combat effectiveness against German fighters during 1944. Statistical analysis, now able to incorporate complete data about which bombers carried modified weapons, showed clear correlation between Morrison's guns and improved defensive performance. The modifications had been relatively inexpensive to implement, requiring primarily skilled labor rather than costly materials or components. However, the modifications also had drawbacks that became more apparent with peacetime analysis. The accelerated rate of fire increased barrel wear significantly, reducing barrel life from approximately 10,000 rounds to approximately 6,000 rounds. The tighter tolerances required more frequent maintenance and cleaning. The modified feed systems were more sensitive to ammunition quality variations, showing higher malfunction rates when using ammunition that didn't meet precise specifications. Most significantly, the tactical situation that had made Morrison's modifications valuable, fighter attacks against bomber formations, was becoming obsolete. Post-war strategic bombing doctrine assumed that future bombers would fly higher and faster than World War II aircraft, making fighter interception more difficult. Jet bombers under development would potentially outrun defending fighters entirely, making defensive armament unnecessary. The official conclusion, documented in Air Force technical reports from 1947, recommended that Morrison's modifications not be adopted as standard for future weapons. The M2 would remain at its standard 450 rounds per minute cyclic rate. Morrison's enhanced rate modifications would be classified as an expedient wartime solution that had served its purpose but need not be perpetuated in peace. This decision frustrated many combat veterans who had experienced Morrison's modifications in action. They knew from direct experience that the weapons worked, that they had saved lives and destroyed enemy aircraft, that the increased firepower had provided genuine tactical advantage. But institutional preferences for standardization, concerns about increased maintenance requirements, and evolving strategic doctrine combined to prevent Morrison's work from becoming permanent Air Force policy. Morrison himself returned to the United States in November 1945. He received no medal, no public recognition, no official commendation for his work. The Army paid him his salary as a civilian machinist, provided transportation home, and thanked him for his service. The modifications that bore his name in informal usage were officially attributed to field testing by 8 Bomber Command armament personnel, in the few official documents that acknowledged them at all. He returned to Dayton, Ohio, and resumed civilian life. He found work as a precision machinist with a company manufacturing industrial equipment, married a widow he had known before the war, and lived quietly until his death in 1968, at age 76. He rarely spoke about his wartime service, and when he did, He focused on the crews he had supported rather than the innovation he had created. The air crews who had flown with Morrison's modified guns remembered him more clearly. Reunion groups and veterans organizations occasionally mentioned the enhanced rate 50s, usually in the context of things that worked but were never made official. Gunnery instructors at post-war Air Force schools sometimes referenced Morrison's modifications as an example of innovative problem-solving, though always with the caveat that unauthorized modifications of service weapons remained prohibited. The technical legacy of Morrison's work proved more enduring than the weapons themselves. The feed system timing modifications he developed influenced post-war machine gun design, even though his specific approach was not adopted for the M2. When the Air Force began developing next-generation aircraft weapons in the 1950s, engineers studied Morrison's technical order and incorporated some of his insights into new designs. The M39 automatic cannon, adopted in the 1950s for fighter armament, used feed timing principles similar to those Morrison had demonstrated. The GAU 420mm cannon, developed for the F-4 Phantom in the early 1960s, employed aggressive feed cam profiles that reflected Morrison's understanding of how feeding cycles could be accelerated without sacrificing reliability. The GAU 8 Avenger 30mm cannon, designed in the 1970s for the A-10 attack aircraft, used feed system architecture that traced conceptual lineage back to Morrison's World War II modifications. None of these weapons systems officially credited Morrison. The engineers who designed them had studied Technical Order 11126B and absorbed its lessons, but institutional memory faded and direct attribution disappeared. By the 1980s, when researchers began documenting the history of American aircraft weapons development, Morrison's name had largely vanished from official records. Rediscovery came through an unexpected source. In 1992, a military historian researching the 8th Air Force's operational effectiveness during World War II encountered references to enhanced rate 50 caliber guns in unit records from 1944. Following these references through archival materials, he located Technical Order 11126B and Morrison's name in the development credits. Further research revealed the full scope of Morrison's program through interviews with surviving veterans, examination of unit histories, and analysis of previously classified correspondence. The historian's article, published in Air Power History Journal in 1994, represented the first comprehensive public documentation of Morrison's work. The article generated renewed interest among firearms historians and military researchers. Additional research revealed details about Morrison's training program, the informal distribution network for his modifications, and the bureaucratic conflicts surrounding unofficial weapons modifications. Technical analysis confirmed that Morrison's approach had indeed achieved the performance improvements that combat reports claimed. Modern recreation of Morrison's modifications, conducted by firearms experts in the early 2000s, demonstrated that his techniques could still produce functioning weapons. A small number of M2S were converted following Morrison's documented procedures, test-fired at military ranges with modern instrumentation, and confirmed to achieve approximately 850 rounds per minute while maintaining adequate reliability. These tests, documented in technical journals and firearms publications, validated Morrison's achievement and demonstrated that his empirical approach to feed system timing had been technically sound. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.